Welcome to Radical Engagements. And I'm in a bad mood today, mainly because I've been dealing with watching people form cargo cults and children's crusades, which I've watched for most of my adult life, as opposed to dealing with the situation at hand and finding hope in whatever great man they can become dependent on while nothing changes. And pointing out that other people project upon these great figures. Oh, the Trumpists, they're delusional about what he believes. Well, but most of you are delusional about what the presidents you support believe. You willingly play fools because the horror of not being a fool is sometimes worse. But why is that? What's the deeper reason for that? Well, let's go into it. It's no surprise that I'm influenced by Joseph Tainter and some other thinkers as I am Thomas Ligotti, although I find Ligotti somewhat tedious, as I am Marx. I don't get asked about it as much because, frankly, it doesn't give people a lot of immediate hope. And given that I'm worried about people becoming overly dependent on complex systems that they don't understand but project upon, and that the smarter you are, the more likely you are to do it, well, that's a problem. In Collapse of Complex Societies, a primer on Tainter's theory. This is from 2019, talking a book from the 1980s that I still think is pretty solid. This is by John Danaher. If you ever visit Rome and wander through the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus, it's not hard to be struck by the sense of the fragility and impermanence. It looks fragile and impermanent. Here are the remnants of the most powerful and complex of ancient European societies, now reduced to ruin and rubble. How does this once proud and mighty empire crumble? You know what? That's not even what got me. What got me was when I was in Egypt looking at mosques that had incredible feats of engineering in them, and yet they couldn't make stone pillars and had to steal them from buildings that were 2,000 years older. And it took until about the 14th century until the technique to create large stone pillars out of quarried material was relearned. Or learning about the decline of technology in Saxon Britain, even though there wasn't a marked decline in life. So the technology wasn't even always expanding people's lifestyle. See, that's what got me. Is not just that progress was more complicated, or that the rational was and the real had a more complex relationship than the real is rational or our humans are irrational. It was way more interesting and complicated than that. People are adaptive, if that's what you mean by rationality. But there are times where this breaks down. Tainter's 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, has an answer to that question and to similar questions you might ask about the collapse of other ancient societies, the Maya, the Incan, the Babylonian, etc. His book is widely cited and discussed amongst those who are interested in the topics of civilizational collapse. Having now read it, I can see why. Tainter presents his own views with a logical simplicity that is often lacking in these debates, only setting out his own theory after having exhaustively categorized and dismissed alternative theories. What's more, his theory is remarkably easy to state and understand. Societies collapse when they hit a point of rapidly declining marginal returns on investments and problem-solving capacity. Despite this, I have yet to see a really good summary of his theory outline. I want to provide one in this post. I will try to focus on the essential elements of Tainter's theory and not on his dismissal of rival theories or his detailed case studies, although his case studies are great. I will also aim to be critical of the theory where needed and provide some reflections on whether or not it is applied to contemporary societies at the end. These reflections will be somewhat idiosyncratic, tied to my own interest in democratic legitimacy and technology. What does Tainter mean by collapse of complex society? Tainter's theory is premised on the assumption that societies do indeed collapse. That's the motivation for his entire book. The fact that he thinks it is in need of an explanation. You might suppose it is a relatively uncontroversial assumption. Tainter starts his book with a comprehensive list of examples of societies that have collapsed. They include the Western Chou Empire, the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, the Western Roman Empire, the Lowland Classic Maya. What could be more conclusive than that? And yet, despite its seeming obviousness, the notion that entire societies do undergo something akin to collapse is actually controversial among scholars of the ancient world. Yeah, there's people who denied Bronze Age collapse happened. I'll give you examples of this later on, but we can see why this controversy might arise by considering some of Tainter's definitions. In his book about collapse of complex societies, it also bears asking, what does he mean by the words collapse and complex society? Fortunately, he does provide some answers. He defines the terms in the following way. 1. Collapse, a society said to collapse when it undergoes a rapid and substantial loss of an established level of social political complexity. This, according to Tainter, is always a political process. It stems from the destruction and decay of social organization and institutions. He gives a list of the kinds of things you can expect to see less of a society undergoing collapse. These include less social stratification and differentiation, less economic specialization, less centralized control, less trade and economic activity, and less production of cultural ephemera, such as monuments, buildings, and artworks, aka social reproduction starts to break down. Complex society. A society is complex when it has a lot of heterogeneity, specialization, and centralized control. In other words, when there are many different institutions, organizations, social functions, and social roles bound and integrated together into some centralized government. Complexity, according to Tainter, is not an all or nothing proposition. It comes in degrees, and imprecise delineation between a complex society and a simple society is disputable. The creation of the state is one of the key steps in the development of complexity. But when exactly a society transitions from being a band or a tribe to a state can be tricky to pin down. We talk about territorialization in regards to this. Tainter talks about when the king of the Franks becomes the king of France, etc., etc., etc. It follows from this initially that the loss of social complexity also comes in degrees. Thus, collapse, like complexity, is itself a continuous variable. How exactly do complex societies emerge? Tainter spends some time discussing this. I won't rehash the discussion here. There are really only two key points that emerge from it, at least from the perspective of understanding his theory. The first is that the emergence of complex societies has something to do with problem solving. Complex societies emerge and sustain themselves by bringing benefits to their members, i.e., by addressing and overcoming barriers to their existential and psychological needs. This doesn't mean that the benefits are evenly shared. Tainter's not a denial of class society. He very much believes in it. Quite the contrary, complex societies are often marked by profound inequity and hierarchy. Some people benefit much more than others. The point is that once they have emerged, complex societies are always threatened to some degree by internal dissent and rebellion, e.g., some people who feel that they aren't getting the most out of the problem-solving bargain. They have two basic strategies for dealing with these threats. One is boosting their perceived legitimacy. Two is coercion and control. The latter requires no explanation. The former is a somewhat subtle idea. One way to boost legitimacy is to increase problem-solving capacity and share the benefit to the dissenters. The long march through the institutions, the use of the Supreme Court. Anyway, the other way is to inculcate the belief that the institutions of the state are sacred and either a religious, divinely mandated, righteous, etc., or non-religious, just, moral, democratic sense. A combination of both is probably required for legitimacy. That's enough by the way of stage setting. But the bottom line is this. Tainter's theories tries to explain the collapse of complex societies, where complexity is a function of the institutional heterogeneity of a society, and where collapse arises when there is a rapid and substantial decline in this complexity. Declining marginal returns theory. Now we know what Tainter is trying to explain. We can turn our attention to the explanation itself. In chapter 4, of the collapse of complex societies, he sets out his explanatory theory. In chapter 5, he explains 3 historical case studies: the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of classical Mayan civilization, and the collapse of the Chacoan society, a North American society based around modern-day New Mexico. I'll be skipping the case studies to focus on the theory itself. However, I do recommend looking at them to get a full sense of how his theory works. You can do so in this article. It's a good article. And the article is Problem Solving Complexity and History by Tainter. You can find it in the Wayback Machine. Or this video lecture. As mentioned at the onset, Tainter's explanatory theory is easy to state. Societies collapse when they reach a point of rapidly declining marginal returns on their investments and problem-solving capacity. AKA, you have spending a lot of energy, not just money, energy, on problem-solving without a lot of returns for the energy expenditure. But this statement captures a lot of important detail. Let's try to unpack it into a series of propositions to capture the underlying logic. Reading note. Tainter identifies 4 key propositions in chapter 4. My approach is a little bit more detailed and identifies 5 key positions. Position 1. Human societies are problem-solving organisms that generate benefits, B, for their members, and in order to sustain themselves, they must continue to solve problems and generate benefits for at least the most powerful of their members. Position 2. Like all organisms, human societies must capture and expend energy, C. In order to sustain their problem-solving capacity, classically, societies have captured energy by foraging, farming, burning fossil fuels, and also through war and imperial expansion. Position 3. Therefore, in order to sustain themselves, societies face a basic cost-benefit equation. The benefits of increased energy expenditure and problem-solving capacity must exceed the cost, i.e., B must be greater than C. Proposition 4. Increased investment in social political complexity yields higher returns, but usually comes at an increase per capita cost, so that at a certain point, the marginal benefits on increased investment are outweighed by the marginal cost. 5. If MC is greater than MB at an increasing rate, society will collapse, aka experience a rapid and significant decline in social and political complexity. Although Tainter does talk about managed versus unmanaged complexity, and I think that does have to be dealt with. We have a chart here. Let's go into it. Phase 1, human societies are problem-solving. Phase 2, like organizations, human societies must capture and expand energy. Phase 3, therefore, in order to sustain the societies face a basic cost-benefit equation. Stage 4, increased investment in social, political, and complexity yields higher returns, but this usually comes at an increased per capita cost, so that at a certain point, the marginal benefits on increased investment are outweighed on the marginal cost. And 5, an increase at an increasing rate, society will collapse. The first 3 propositions are conceptual in nature. Indeed, they almost have the quality of a truism or platitudes. I don't see how premise 2 can be denied. It's like a natural physical law. Premise 1 might be questionable, but it looks basically right to me. One thing you might worry about is whether problem-solving capacity alone sustains a society. As highlighted earlier, societies can also sustain themselves by boosting perceived legitimacy through coercion. So maybe at a certain point in their evolution, societies don't need to keep problem-solving in order to survive. That, however, seems unlikely, and when you think about it a bit more, both strategies end up confirming the same central importance of the problem-solving capacity. After all, legitimacy is, at least in part, determined by problem-solving capacity, and coercion is itself costly. It's very costly. Conflict and violence is costly. It means literally throwing resources down the drain. Problem-solving capacity exercise and thus confronts the same basic cost-benefit equations alluded to and problem 3. It's really P4 and P5 are the heart of Tainter's theory, and most of his attention in chapter 4 is dedicated to proving that P4 is true, that complex social organizations really do confront declining marginal benefits. Chapter 5 looks at whether P5 is confirmed by the historical record. Tainter gets 4 examples of P4 playing out in human societies. The first example has to do with agricultural production. Using work done originally by Esther Bosrup, Tainter documents how, prior to mechanization, agricultural intensification resulted in declining marginal benefits, i.e., declining marginal yields and destruction to the soil. People in foraging societies usually don't have to work all that hard to secure their basic calorie needs. We see this by looking at contemporary equivalents, where as little as 2.5 hours of work per day per person is all that is required. Contrast with non-mechanized agricultural societies. Back-breaking work from dawn till dusk is often required, and yet it generates diminishing returns per unit of labor through the degradation of the soil. Tainter uses a case study from farming communities in northern Greece to illustrate this. Data from these case studies suggests that labor applied at an annual rate of about 200 hours per hectare is roughly 15 times more productive in returns per hours of labor than labor applied at 2,000 hours per hectare. The second example has to do with knowledge production with information processing power, broadly speaking, the intelligence of society. And intelligence is social as well as individual, peeps. Tainter uses lots of examples to illustrate this problem, all having to do with returns on education and research development. He documents how the early years of education generate far greater returns than the latter. That's true. You see most of the benefits of literacy as attained by fourth grade. And how most industrial societies seem to be undergoing a decline in their rates of innovation. Why do we focus more and more on later education when it's the less efficient and less effective? Anyone who's ever studied education knows this. If you're dealing with adults, you're already in some ways too late. This is actually something that has become documented since Tainter wrote the book. A recent paper from Nicholas Broom and colleagues, for example, suggests we are currently undergoing a significant marginal decline in returns on research and development spending. Exponentially more money is being invested in education, research, industrial complex in order to sustain existing levels of growth, which I think we see this in AI. Michael Nearson and Patrick Collison have a nice article summarizing this problem that looks at several different indicators of marginal decline. None of this should be decreasing. There is a low-hanging fruit principle at play in most fields of research and development. The easy solution theories, insights are developed first and then become progressively more difficult. See the problem of physics, if you don't believe me here. The third example has to do with the bureaucratic power and control. Tainter gives several well-documented examples of administrative bloat and mission creep in bureaucratic organizations, particularly the military and the Navy. These organizations are often central to society problem solving, but they tend to proliferate, i.e., more and more specialized organizations are developed to deal with discrete problems and grow in size to cope with the challenges. This usually results in declining returns as costly administrative staff are hired to manage complex social organizations compared to relatively few frontline workers, soldiers, doctors, etc. There's the exponential growth in admin and education and healthcare should make this clear to you. We see this pattern of administrative burden declining and kind of returns crop up over and over and over again in human history. Modern universities are good examples, as are modern hospitals. That's me adding that. The fourth example has to do with the decline in rate of overall economic productivity. This is the thing leftists just don't believe in. They're always arguing with me about it. Well, there is no decline in rate of profits. Well, there's a decline in rate of productivity. All productivity settles down. Growth is required for capital, but it drops dramatically as the society is more developed. And you can look at all historical rates to see this. Early industrialization always seems to be gangbusters in growth. And then when that stops and you've reached maturity, you slow down to like between 3 and 5% is like the best you can do. And you often have to do more and more games and bullshit to get that 3 to 5% even on paper. As societies increase in complexity, they might initially generate high rates of economic growth, but over time, as they grow more complex, they tend to sustain relatively inferior rates of economic growth and have to invest more money, time, and effort to sustain these rates. This is often linked to the problem of declining returns on education and research, and indeed there is something that Nicholas Broom and his colleagues document quite well in a paper on declining rates of innovation. Some people might complain that these examples are cherry-picked and not all societies confront the declining marginal return. Tainter responds by arguing that this doesn't matter, as he puts. The fact that such examples can be compelled does not mean that all economic trends follow the same curve. A tendency of the rate of profit to fall, not a law. nor that the social economic processes in complex societies follow the law of diminishing returns. It also does not mean that such trends are occurring at any specific sphere are irreversible. Where this law is operative, however, is serious consequences can be expected, and those are the situations of interest here. Comments like this provide some reassurance, particularly when it comes to assessing our own era. Maybe we can buck the trend. Still, Tincture's point seems to remain valid. Complex societies can run into problems with declining marginal returns, and when they do, the prospect of collapse looms large. He sums it up by drawing a curve that he thinks maps out the common relationship between the benefits and costs of increased and captures the dilemma confronted by all societies that must invest in increased complexity. Bam. This curve is not based on any data. It is simply a mental model that we can use to understand the process of collapse. The idea is that societies often do well in the early stages of complexity, but they often peak at point B2, C2 in the diagram above and enter a state of decline. You can see this B2, C2, B2, C2, and you hit peak and then decline. At this point, things are often still getting better, but at a declining rate, and if the rate of decline speeds up, the overall benefits of complexity are outweighed by the cost. Society will have to spend more resources to ensure stability, either through boosting legitimacy or increased coercion, but these solutions are often only temporary stopgaps, and at a certain point, decline becomes unstoppable. We have to remember that Tincture's also a social ecologist, so he's thinking about this in terms of the wasting of material resources to maintain this increased complexity. This, in a nutshell, is Tincture's theory. Criticisms of Tincture's theory. There are many ways to criticize Tincture's theory. The most obvious would be to challenge the empirical bona fides. As Tincture himself notes, it's hard to prove or confirm or even falsify a theory of collapse. We can't run a control experimental test. We are forced to instead interpret the historical evidence and see where it fits the theory. There is always a problematic exercise as people are inclined to twist or exclude facts in order to promote their preferred theory, and they may do this unintentionally or without malice. I think it's usually without malice. That said, there have been some attempts to develop computerized models of human societies that can test these different theories. And I know at least one attempt to do this with Tincture theory, which suggested it can explain societal collapse. But I suspect these model building exercises are also fraught with difficulty, particularly when it goes into deciding what goes into the model. More generally, and perhaps more seriously, it is worth noting that there are archaeologists and historians who very much doubt the very idea of societal collapse. Yeah, I think these people are desperate, but that's just me. There's people who also doubt that there's cycles in history, but the people who say that are often living through one. I mentioned this earlier. After Jared Diamond wrote his best-selling book Collapse, and a somewhat similar to Tincture's book that tries to document and explain historical examples of societal collapse, a group of scholars got together to write a detailed rebuttal of the examples he used. They argued that human societies are remarkably resilient. They shift, evolve, and adapt rather than collapse. The theme is taken up by Guy Middleton in this 2011 book, Understanding Collapse, which reviews all the infamous examples of societal collapse and suggests that the evidence for actual collapse in each case is limited. Aspects of a given society might decline, certain buildings or settlements might be abandoned, and particular regime states might be overthrown, but this does not mean civilization as a whole has collapsed. Middleton wrote a short summary of his thesis for ARM magazine, which you can read online, and I have. Tincture might be able to escape these criticisms by arguing that for him, collapse is a matter of degrees. He's not claiming that societies disappear or self-destruct. He's not. Although he does claim it happens sometimes. He is claiming that they experience rapid declines in complexity. But this raises another problem. There's a certain fuzziness to each of the concepts Tincture uses to support his theory, and that makes it a bit too easy to manage the historical data to fit the theoretical parameters. This is true for the anti-declinists too, though. One example of this was the idea that collapse arises from rapid and substantial decline in social political complexity. But what is rapid and substantial decline? Some examples Tincture uses involve societies that change over the course of centuries. Is that rapid? I'm not so sure. Yeah. Furthermore, by zooming in on a particular example of apparent big decline in complexity, there's a sense then in which his theory misses the bigger picture, namely, that human civilization really seems defined by the remarkable increase in socio-political complexity over time. Sure, there have been pockets of decline here and there, But in a long, steeper history, things have gotten much more complex. Well, only in 500 years, only in 5,000 years, buddy. That's the thing. The actual evidence that we have for all this is within a 5,000 year window, and human beings have been around for hundreds of thousands. This brings me to what I think is the most important and interesting criticism of the theory. Remember, Tainter claims that society grows the caused by decline and marginal return on problem-solving ability. You might argue that this can be averted by some new technological innovation, one that boosts society's problem-solving ability. This technological breakthrough would allow society to shift a new cost-benefit curve and avoid the problem of declining returns. A classic example would be this shift from agricultural to industrial society, which ends Malthusianism to some degree. This is made possible by a series of technological breakthroughs that enabled us to more effectively harness energy from fossil fuels. Initially, other than power sources were discovered, then boosted Western European society's problem-solving ability by massive increases in its energy capture, as well as the efficiency with which it could utilize the energy. This is something documented at length in Ian Morris's work on societal development. Tainter is well aware of this, and examples like this, He indeed discusses the Industrial Revolution in some of his work, noting that it was, to some extent, a lucky breakthrough because English society was encountering a problem of declining marginal returns after the shift from charcoal burning to coal burning. The steam engine came at just the right time. Furthermore, and more generally, he argues that if the technological breakthrough is made that is often a temporary solution at best, ultimately the problem of declining marginal returns will be encountered through this technological breakthrough. I wonder about this, though, and it puts me around debates around peak oil and about other finite resources. Debates rely on the same basic logic as Tainter theory. They assume that we are overly dependent on a particular resource, oil, coal, gas, etc., and that this resource is finite. Granting this finitude, we eventually grow to peak in our exploitation of the resource and enter a period of terminal decline. This logic is ineludible. If the resource in question is finite, it simply must be true. If we continue to exploit it, it will reach a point of decline. The problem is that unless we actually know the full stock of the relevant resources, we don't know where we are on the relevant exploitation curve. In his book, The Wizard and the Prophet, Charles Mann points out that people have repeatedly claimed that we have reached or are about to reach peak oil. This has been true since the 1800s. These people have repeatedly been proven wrong. We are producing and consuming more oil today than ever before, and we don't know where we are in the exploitation curve. It seems to me that Tainter's theory acries the same basic problem. Maybe all innovations and problem-solving ability will eventually encounter the problem of declining returns. But how confident are we at our ability to predict when this might be? I don't think we can be. Actually, this is me talking. I don't think we know. Furthermore, there are more optimistic views out there. The economist Julian Simmons, for example, famously argued that human problem-solving is an infinite resource, not a finite one. I think that's bullshit. So the ineludible logic of peak oil argument may not apply. That said, I'm not Pollyannish about the prospects of technological solutions to our problems. Me neither. I've noticed that technological solutions require more and more energy. Technological innovations might help us avoid collapse, but they themselves often create new problems that need to be solved. This is something that Tainter makes much of in his 88 book. But this is not something that Tainter makes much of in his 88 book, but it is something that was greatly vexes contemporary researchers, particularly those focused on the topic of existential risk. Nick Bostrom's paper, on vulnerable world hypothesis, neatly sums up these fears, suggesting that technology can both solve our problems and make our world more vulnerable to existential collapse, a cascade failure. Conclusion: within humanity, all of this leads to the inevitable question: how do Tainter's theory apply to the present day? After all, that's really what motivates the historical inquiry, isn't it? Perhaps some of us are interested in understanding the decline of the Roman Empire for its own sake, but lurking in the back of most people's mind is a fear that our civilization is about to collapse. Well, as you might imagine from my previous remarks, I'm somewhat skeptical about the wisdom of this question. The logical simplicity of Tainter's theory combined with its fuzziness makes it both tempting and dangerous to apply to our present day. I think it is easy to apply to our present day, but I don't think you can know where you are on the spectrum. Certainly, there are plenty of warnings out there to the current limits in our problem-solving capacity and environmental challenges we face in the coming decades. And there's more since this has been written. Charles Mann's aforementioned book, The Wizard and the Prophet, is an excellent primer on these challenges. But it's hard to say where exactly we are on Tainter's cost-benefit curve, or whether we might shift to a new curve with some technological breakthrough. Nevertheless, I want to want to reflect on 2 reflections on the application of Taiter's theory to the modern era. I think it applies socially. I'll just tell you that. I think we see social complexity where people are more and more specialized in ways that they cannot actually speak to larger problems unless outsource their thinking to other people, making them more and more dependent on institutions where everyone else is doing that. And there's no one really in charge or has a large enough point of view, despite their specialization, to know what to do. And it disempowers the general public, who often does have a feeling of the vague gist of things, but has no idea how to enact it. So you have this weird pushback between the elites and the non-elite, which is why a lot of people misrecognize where the origins of our social problems are. And like the elite middle management or liberals or whatever, where really they're all just trying to keep a certain system and a certain pyramid on top of that system going. And it takes more and more resources to do. You don't believe me? Look at what people are saying we're going to have to increase our power grid to do to maintain our current economic growth with AI. It's pretty impressive what these predictions are. And people who try to push back on this often are doing so with very limited knowledge of the way the overall grid works. Otherwise, you wouldn't have stuff like trying to break 3 Mile Island back just to power Microsoft data centers. And if you don't believe me, I'll put a link in the show notes. The first has to do with democracy. Democratic institutional governments are currently the most favored problem-solving system in the world. Yet many people perceive them to have entered a state of stagnation and decline, actually, and they've become less and less democratically responsive. This is taken up in David Runciman's book, How Democracies End, far better than the more hyped American equivalent, How Democracies Die, which argues that mature democracies have entered a midlife crisis. Democracy's primary tools for increasing its problem-solving capacity and perceived legitimacy is to enlarge the voting franchise and increase transparency and accountability. But many mature democracies have hit a point of declining marginal returns on these mechanisms. This may very well be at Tainter's inflection point. This brings me to a second reflection, and it has to do with the role of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, improving our problem-solving capacity. Cough, cough. I think this is more true now than when this was written in 2019. According to some of its advocates, a significant breakthrough in AI could be a deus ex machina. We need to solve our emerging problems. Instead of relying on imperfect, squabbling human intelligence, we could rely on a more perfected artificial form. This argument that Miles Brundage makes explicit in his paper called the Case for Conditional Optimism about AI, and it's explicit in other works on AI and algorithmic governments. The problem is that with this, however, it is the technological solutions that suffer from significant legitimacy crisis. We see this every day in scandals around tech companies and the institutification of the internet. It seems that we could face a hard trade-off in the not-too-distant future. After we have a hard legitimate problem-solving institutions to face the problem of rapidly declining marginal returns, or we have a fast, efficient, and technologically mediated institutions that suffer from a legitimacy deficit. Although I did not express it in these terms, this was effectively my argument in the paper, The Threat of algorithmocracy. Now, obviously, I think Tainter's true. I do think there's some truth that people as individuals are more elastic than civilization collapse will say, but you might be saying what's really happening between the collapses and non-collapses is debating over what you can legitimately call a civilization, not debating over the exhaustion of highly complex answers and resources needed to back them up. Furthermore, when you have a modus operandi that literally is dependent on constant exponential growth, that's impossible. I'm not a pro or degrowther. I don't think about this stuff in those terms. I think marginal economic growth is a weird way to think about what a society does. But when most everything's disposable, so that you have to stay replacing stuff in the market, you're going to exhaust resources. And individual choices don't really affect that. Social choices do. Large-scale ones. We're in a changing world, folks. And I think a lot of stuff is changing, and a lot of the answers people are depending on make them more dependent on technologies that they less understand. And with less people who can really put it all together, and with pitchmen and cargo cultists selling it all to you. Maybe it's time for some fucking pessimism, so you maybe can have something real to hope in. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to. I don't fucking care.